Why do we want answers now? Why is it so hard to wait, so hard not to know, so hard to live without immediate clarity? That is not a small question because many of us do not merely want understanding. We want relief. We want resolution. We want the uncertainty to stop pressing on us. We want to know what is going to happen, why this is taking so long, whether the relationship will work, whether the door will open, whether the prayer means anything, whether this season has purpose, whether God is actually doing something, or whether we are just standing still while life moves past us. And because we want that so badly, we often start confusing quick answers with peace. But they are not the same thing. An answer can calm the mind for a moment and still leave the soul unformed. A delay can trouble the mind for a season and still deepen the soul in ways answers never could. That is where we need to begin, because our problem is not simply that we like clarity. Clarity is a gift. The deeper problem is that we often want answers more than we want trust. We want explanation more than surrender. We want a map more than a guide. And that changes the whole spiritual life. Because when answers become the thing we need most, then uncertainty starts to feel unbearable. Delay starts to feel meaningless. Silence starts to feel like abandonment. The hidden season starts to feel like wasted time. And instead of asking, how do I remain faithful here? We begin asking only, when do I finally get to know? That is such a human question, and most of us know it well. We want to know why the prayer has not been answered yet. We want to know why healing is taking so long. We want to know whether we should stay or leave. We want to know if this relationship is going anywhere. We want to know if the sacrifice is worth it. We want to know if the suffering means something. We want to know when life will become clearer, lighter, more settled, more obvious. Because not knowing feels exposed. Not knowing forces us to live without control. It forces us to move without guarantees. It forces us to admit that we are not standing above our life, interpreting it with perfect vision. We are inside it, limited, waiting, often confused. And that is where trust becomes necessary. Not because answers are bad, but because answers are not always what God gives first. The Bible shows this again and again. Think about Abraham. God calls Abraham to leave his country, his kindred, his father's house, and go to a land that God will show him. Just notice the structure of that. God does not hand Abraham a finished blueprint. He gives him a promise and a direction. Go to the land I will show you. That is not the same as, here is the whole plan. Abraham is given enough light to obey, not enough detail to control the future. And that is often how God works, because what Abraham is being formed into is not merely a man with information. He is being formed into a man of faith, and faith is not built by having every answer in advance. It is built by learning to move with God before the entire picture is visible. That is very hard for us. We often think trust would become easy if God would only explain more. But in Scripture, God often gives enough clarity for obedience and withholds the rest, not to torment, but to form, not to confuse, but to deepen reliance. Now think about Israel in the wilderness. After God delivers them from Egypt, he does not take them immediately into a life of settled abundance. He leads them into the wilderness. And the wilderness is not only hard because of lack, it is hard because of uncertainty. Day by day, they have to depend on manna. Day by day, they have to follow the cloud. Day by day, they have to live without securing themselves through visible certainty. That is exhausting, and it reveals something about the human heart. Again and again, they would rather have a predictable Egypt than a mysterious freedom with God. Why? Because slavery at least came with familiar structures. The wilderness required trust, and many of us are not that different. We say we want God's will, but often what we really want is a kind of certainty that would spare us from trust. We want a life so explained that faith becomes almost unnecessary. We want enough answers to never have to feel the exposure of dependence. But dependence is where much of the spiritual life is formed. Now think about Job. Job loses his children, his wealth, his health, and the stability of his world. And what does he want? He wants an answer. He wants to understand. Why has this happened? What is God doing? What is the hidden logic underneath this unbearable suffering? That is not a wrong desire. It is a deeply human one. And for much of the book, Job's friends offer answers. That is part of what makes the book so powerful. They speak in explanations. They try to tidy suffering into moral formulas. They think if they can explain it, they can control it. If they can diagnose it, they can make the world feel coherent again. But they are wrong. Their answers are too quick, too neat, too proud. And when God finally speaks, he does not give Job the tidy explanation he wanted. Instead, he reveals something larger, the vastness of divine wisdom and the smallness of human perspective. That is not cruel. It is clarifying. Job is being shown that trust does not always come through explanation. Sometimes it comes through encounter. Sometimes the answer is not a reason, but a revelation of who God is. That matters. Because one of our hidden assumptions is that if we had the answer, we would have peace. But the Bible keeps showing that peace is not always the product of explanation. Often, it is the product of learning who God is when explanation does not come. Now move into the New Testament and think about Mary. When the angel tells Mary she will bear the Christ, she does ask a question. How will this be? That is important. Scripture is not against questions. Trust is not the refusal to ask. But what happens next? Mary does not receive the entire future laid out in detail. She receives enough to say yes. And then she says, "Behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word." That is one of the great sentences of trust in all of Scripture. She does not know all that will come. She does not know all that it will cost. She does not know how the story will unfold. She is given enough to obey, enough to surrender, enough to receive. And that is often the form of faithful living, not total explanation, enough light for the next step. Now think about the disciples. Again and again, they want clarity on the timeline. Is this the moment? Is the kingdom now? What is happening? After the resurrection, they still asked Jesus, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" And Jesus does something very interesting. He does not satisfy their need for full answers. He says, in effect, "The times and seasons are not yours to know." Then he turns them toward what is theirs to do. That is such a needed correction, because many of us spend enormous energy trying to know what is not ours to know, while neglecting what is ours to do. We want tomorrow explained, while today remains half-lived. We want the entire future interpreted, while the next act of obedience is sitting untouched in front of us. And that is where the hunger for answers can become spiritually distorting. Not because answers never matter, but because they can become a way of postponing trust. We say, "Once I understand, then I will obey. Once I know, then I will rest. Once this is clear, then I will surrender. Once the outcome is visible, then I will move." But much of life with God runs in the opposite order. We obey, and then clarity grows. We trust, and then peace deepens. We remain, and then understanding begins to ripen. This does not mean every question is bad. It means questions must not become conditions we place on faithfulness. Now let us go deeper. Why do we want answers now? Partly because uncertainty feels like weakness. It exposes our limits. It shows us that we are not sovereign. It reminds us that we cannot force meaning into visibility on demand. But partly we want answers because answers give us the illusion of control. If I know what is happening, I can prepare. If I know what this means, I can protect myself. If I know where this is going, I can relax. If I know why the suffering came, I can fit it into a system. And in that sense, the demand for immediate answers is often not only intellectual, it is emotional self-protection. It is the attempt to escape vulnerability by turning mystery into information. But mystery does not always disappear. and the soul cannot mature by only living where it feels in control. That is why trust matters so much. Trust is not passivity. It is not vague optimism. It is not pretending not to care. Trust is the decision to remain in honest dependence on God when the future is still not available to us in explained form. That is why Proverbs says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding." That verse is often quoted quickly, but it is profound. It does not say understanding is useless. It says our own understanding is not a sufficient foundation. There are times when the mind reaches its edge. There are seasons when what we can interpret is not enough to support the weight we are carrying. And in those moments, trust is not anti intellectual, it is existentially necessary. We need something firmer than our ability to decode the whole story. Now consider Jesus in Gethsemane. Jesus knows suffering is coming, but the experience is still agonizing. He prays honestly. He asks if the cup might pass from him. That matters. Trust does not require emotional flatness. Trust does not forbid honest desire for another way. But then comes the deeper line. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done. There it is. Not a tidy answer, not relief through explanation. Trust. And that trust is not detached. It is costly, trembling, real. It happens inside anguish. That is important because many of us imagine trust as something serene people do when they are no longer troubled. But biblical trust often happens in the middle of turmoil. It is not the absence of struggle, it is surrender inside struggle. So, what do we do when we want answers now? First, we tell the truth about what we really want. Often we say we want clarity when what we really want is relief. We want the discomfort of uncertainty to stop. Naming that matters because once we are honest, we can bring the real thing before God. Second, we ask whether the hunger for answers is helping us obey or helping us stall. Sometimes questions are sincere invitations to wisdom. Sometimes they are delay tactics of the soul. We keep circling the unknown because action without guarantees feels too costly. Third, we learn to distinguish between what is ours to know and what is ours to do. This is one of the great adult disciplines. There are things we do not know: outcomes, timings, hidden meanings, future developments. But there are often things we do know: tell the truth, pray, forgive, wait faithfully, do the next right thing, remain honest, refuse bitterness, keep showing up. Fourth, we practice receiving partial light. This is hard. Most of us want the 10-step plan. Often God gives the next step. Most of us want final interpretation. Often God gives daily bread. Most of us want future security. Often God gives present companionship. And fifth, we remember that God's silence is not the same as God's absence. Some of the most dangerous spiritual conclusions are made too quickly in seasons of not knowing. We assume delay means neglect. We assume mystery means indifference. We assume hiddenness means abandonment. But Scripture gives us story after story in which God is deeply at work before that work becomes visible. Joseph did not know in the pit. Israel did not know in the wilderness. Job did not know in his suffering. The disciples did not know on the road to Emmaus. And yet God was not absent from any of it. So let me end here. Some of us are desperate for answers, not because we are shallow, because we are tired, because we are hurting, because uncertainty has been pressing on us for a long time, because we do not know how long we can keep standing in the unresolved. And if that is where you are, the Bible does not shame that ache. It speaks into it. It tells you that wanting understanding is human, but it also tells you that peace does not always come through getting the answer now. Sometimes peace comes through learning that the God you do not fully understand is still trustworthy. That is harder. and deeper. Because answers can calm you for a moment. Trust can carry you through a season. Answers can satisfy the mind temporarily. Trust can steady the soul. And often, the life of faith is not about finally getting every explanation we crave. It is about learning, slowly and painfully and beautifully, that God can be trusted even in what he has not yet explained.